Hey class. In this lesson we're going to look at Aristotle's cosmology. So we've been looking at Aristotle's worldview, especially the dynamic sense of being and his idea of hylomorphism. And all of that remained very kind of theoretical, metaphysical, although he does give concrete examples, which I tried to work through. But now I want to give a kind of vignette of his worldview in terms of the physical world that we sense and how he would look at natural processes in nature. So that's his cosmology. His cosmology is his view of the cosmos as a whole. And really, Aristotle's view of the cosmos is very interconnected. Everything is interrelated with everything else and follows from the principles of his dynamic sense of being, his hylomorphism. So the Aristotelian world is finite. It's a sphere, and there's nothing outside of it. Nothing physical, at least. And what technically is outside of it is the unmoved mover, which is God, Aristotle's God. And it's not technically outside of it because Aristotle's God does not have space. It doesn't take up space. It's not a physical object. But it is what contains and holds together the entire cosmos. So the outer layer of the cosmos is this ethereal substance, and it's what comprises the stars and the sun. And it is it's a substance that's very nature is to move in a revolutionary movement. So its very existence is what we see in the sky. It's transiting, and it's giving light and warmth to the rest of the cosmos. Each of the elements of the natural world that the Greeks conceived as the most basic makeup of the world, earth, water, air, and fire, these are all contained within the ether as the outer shell of the universe. So I'm going to go through these all, starting from the unmoved mover down to the surface of the earth where animals and human life moves about. So we have the unmoved mover. The unmoved mover is a thinking thought. It's a thought of thought itself. Now that's a really abstract idea, but basically it is a cosmic principle. It's something that doesn't exist as a body or as part of the cosmos, but which makes the cosmos itself in its act of thought. So God thinks of himself, essentially, and that thought is what preserves and creates the entire universe. So the unmoved mover, like this, is very much like the sun. It gives without being itself moved. So the sun imparts light down onto the surface of the earth, and that, helps plants grow. It warms the air that we're surrounded by. It warms the water. It makes the water evaporate into air. It moves the things on the surface. But in the process of moving those things, it is not itself moved. It is not changed by changing something else. And that's what the unmoved mover is like. So the sun actually imitates the unmoved mover. It acts as if it was the unmoved mover. So the unmoved mover is not something that moves something by pushing it. It's something that moves it by being a final cause. It's that towards which other things act. So Aristotle says at one point, we are moved by someone else's sadness, right? We sympathize with them. That doesn't mean that the person actually touches us. They don't have to cause us to be sad. They don't have to do something that makes us sad. Rather, we see them and we feel sad. We're moved by them without moving that thing in return. We don't change the person by sympathizing with them. So the unmoved mover is like that. Everything in the universe strives towards being like the unmoved mover. They all imitate the unmoved mover. So the ether is this layer of perfect substance at the outer edge of the universe, and it moves in a completely revolutionary or circular movement. And this movement is perfect because it's able to continue forever. It's able to always keep going, as opposed to the movement of all of the other elements, as we'll see. And this holds the universe together. It contains the universe. It holds it in place. So next in this kind of organization of the cosmos is fire. Fire burns and it rises up. Aristotle thinks that this is something immediately observable in the world. And so at the top of the atmosphere, there's going to be a layer of fire, and this layer of fire is held down by the ether, but it rises up above the air. And so fire moves in a linear direction. It moves up. But it can't go on forever. It eventually reaches that limit of the ether and stops. Therefore, its movement is imperfect. Unlike the ether, which can go in a circle forever, the fire will reach a point and it will be stopped. Now, fire is a kind of rising and burning. It's defined by its processes, by its effects that it has in relation to other things. It burns wood and it rises through air. It's something active and it causes changes in the world. So fire is itself a compound of hot and dry, which directly links it to the other four elements. Air is hot and moist, water is cold and moist, earth is cold and dry. So there's this interconnection of all of the elements together, and they are all completely separate from the ether. The ether is, it's not dry, and it's not moist, and it's not hot, and it's not cold, but it's somehow the perfect unity of all of those properties together. It's neither active nor passive. It is purely expressive of it's a pure activity. It's not an activity in relation to something passive. So fire acts by burning something. Well, the ether doesn't act on anything. It just enacts itself in the same way that the sun puts out this perfect light. So this is Aristotle's idea here. And so each of the elements holds the other ones down. So you see on the surface of water that air is holding the water down. And you see that the earth holds the water up as a kind of bed for the water. So each of the elements encapsulates the other ones all the way down to earth. And earth is the most passive of all of the elements. It falls, it crumbles, it's passive, it's receptive. Now, all of these elements don't really exist in isolation. The atmosphere is full of water. It's air, but it's full of these clouds that are full of water. And it has all of these winds that are moist winds full of water. And on the Earth's surface, we find all of these compounds, minerals and metals. So Aristotle thinks that metal has a kind of composition of water within it, a kind of moisture in it. And he doesn't really think that there's any pure earth. Earth is really always mixed with water within it. But more importantly, the compounds like plants and animals and humans. So plants and animals and humans are a mixture of all four of the elements. And in a way, they're a mixture also of ether. So Aristotle says that animals have within them a kind of vital heat, or he'll call it at other times a pneuma, which means a kind of breath. And that breath, that vital heat, is really a kind of divine substance. And that's what makes the living animal living. Okay, so in this cosmological view of Aristotle, there are no atoms. He rejects atomism. Bodies are all composites. So fire is a composite of hot and dry, right? Nothing is, there's not atoms that produce heat and atoms that produce dryness, and then you mix them together. There's a body that concretely expresses both of those, and that's what nature is. Nature is this composition of different forces in a concrete unity, something that you can't remove heat. You can't have heat by itself. That doesn't exist for Aristotle. You have a dry heat, which is fire, and you have a moist heat, which is air. So hot and dry and these kinds of properties, these kinds of forces, they exist in compositions. So that's Aristotle's hylomorphic view of nature, as we've seen. So bodies are all composite continuities. They're a plenum, as he says. There's no void. There's no atoms with void between them. There's just forces that completely fill the body that they are. And actually, we think atomism is very similar to what we think today. Well, there were atomistic theories like the ones of Democritus back in the 50s and stuff like that. But actually with quantum mechanics now, force has become the underlying reality. Force and electromagnetic force or energy, these kinds of things. So actually they're much more similar to what Aristotle thought. Aristotle thinks that space is something that depends on the force, the relations of force. And that's what they say in quantum mechanics now, that space emerges through the interaction of the forces of subatomic particles. So actually, Aristotle's account is a little bit more true to the science. Although we do know that there are atoms, and so Aristotle's wrong on that account. You can't actually break down a body to something that is different than the body itself. But Aristotle's idea was that bodies are made up of things like the body itself. So if I divide water forever, smaller and smaller pieces, each piece will be a bulk of water. It'll still have a certain continuity to it. It won't become an atom. An atom is something that is indivisible. It has no continuity to it. It doesn't have one side and another side. It's like a point. A mathematical point has no breadth to it whatsoever. So he says, how can you ever make a body that has breadth out of things that have absolutely no breadth? And that's the way Democritus defines atoms, as mathematical points. So actually, Democritus was wrong and Aristotle was right in a certain way, but also Aristotle was wrong in a certain way. It's intellectual history. What can you expect? That's the way things are. Okay, so all of the bodies in nature are made up of forces. Fire is a force of drying and heating, right? It's the mixture of those two forces. Now, let's take a look at life. What happens in life? Well, we need vital heat, pneuma. And Aristotle actually thinks that there are events in which life spontaneously emerges in certain conditions. And what happens in those conditions? So he thinks that actually in a decaying body, for instance, you have maggots, come about. And that comes about because flies plant eggs. But Aristotle didn't know that. He thought that somehow there was an emergence of life there, a spontaneous emergence. But what happens in that emergence is there's a perfect balance between these natural forces. So dry, moist, cold, hot. These things converge to a perfect mean. And that the word mean is in Greek is logos, and logos means speech, reason, balance, proportion, all of these things. So we have a proportion of dryness and moisture and hotness and coldness, and that is what defines the vital heat. And when Aristotle looks at animals, for instance, he finds that they have this warmth to them that is required for life, and a corpse obviously turns cold. So what is it that keeps that healthy heat alive, that keeps them alive? Well, it's balancing out these forces, hot and dry and moist and cold. So there's a kind of harmonizing. The healthy animal, the vital activity in their body tunes and harmonizes these forces. The soul is the unity of these balancing forces. So the soul is the unity of the activity of life. Digestion and reproduction and sensation and imagination and memory and reason, they're all focalized, they're all channeled together, they converge in preserving life. Just like some of the vital processes are producing more moisture and some of them are producing more warmth. but then they have to be balanced out by other vital processes that dry and that cool. And so it's that perfect balancing which allows for the animal to preserve itself. And so in this same kind of conception of balance, Aristotle is able to define the activity of the senses. The sense of touch is sensitive to hot and cold, dry and moist, hard and soft. But how is it sensitive to those? Well, it holds itself in an equilibrium between dry and moist, right? And by holding itself at a perfect equilibrium of dry and moist, when the skin is made more dry or more moist, it senses it by being pushed out of that equilibrium. So it has a kind of active force holding it in its equilibrium state, and it's passive insofar as some contact with another object pushes it into a different state. So it becomes hot by touching a hot object like a stove, and it's passive in the sense that it's receiving that, and so it's becoming hot outside of its equilibrium state, and that causes it to be sensitive. And this goes for hearing, loud and soft, hard and high and low, slow and fast. All of these things, they come about because the organ is held in equilibrium. And so Aristotle gives us this taxonomy of all the different parts of the soul. And it's the human which contains them all. So the human is going to be the kind of perfect form of life. And he says that each of the forms of the bodies of different things, plants, animals, and humans, are analogously organized, but only the human has a perfect form. So in a plant, their mouth is their roots. The roots gather the food and give it to the rest of the body. And so he says that a plant is actually, its head is in the ground, and so it's kind of inverted. And an animal, on the other hand, is oriented front and back, like straight ahead. It moves ahead and backward, and that's its main directionality. And its mouth goes forward. But in a human, the human is turned upright. And it's this turning upright which makes the human capable of reason. He thinks that the material elements of the body are always falling, just as Earth is always falling. And so the body is incapable of producing reason because of this falling that keeps happening to it. And this happens in the animal as well. And it's only by turning itself upright that the human is capable of having an intellect. And so the human is able to direct all of its vital activities towards rational pursuits. And so as we saw in a previous lecture about the developmental, the way in which each power of the soul leads towards higher and higher powers, pleasure and pain work very similar to the way that the body maintains its health. There's going to be excesses in both directions, and the body needs, the emotions need to be balanced out. And this is what habit and virtue and education consists of, avoiding the excesses. So life is kind of already doing what virtue needs to continue doing, which is balancing out excess and deficiency. And just one last thing I want to hit on here. Aristotle defines the soul as the being at work of the body. It's its pre-programmed type of activity. So the body has certain activities which will preserve its life, balancing out its forces, kindling this vital heat, this breath of life. So he defines it as the being at work of a body having life potentially. So the vital heat is the potential of life. It is what makes life capable of being sustained. But the soul is what organizes that. It's what directs it. It's what unifies all of these various activities and organs. So you need vital heat in the stomach and in the heart and in the blood. but those are each only potentially a living thing. They need to be brought together, and that's what the soul does. The soul is this entelekia. The being at work this is the Greek word entelekia, and Aristotle actually makes this word up. He coins it himself, and it means eke at the end, kia. It means a kind of force, a kind of holding and replenishing of force, and tele means complete or perfect. So it's a complete, perfect holding of force. And the N at the beginning means in, so it means something internal. So it's an internal, complete holding of a replenishing force. That's what this word means. It's a really fascinating word, and Aristotle made it up himself. So it's not just a force like fire, which just tends to go up forever until it's pushed back down by the outer layer of the stars. There's this inner revitalizing force of nature that makes up the soul of each living thing and makes it an organized being that preserves its own form. So in the cosmos, Aristotle, he holds it all together in this finite world that is, you can't go outside of it. There's no infinite expanse of the universe. There's no multiverse. There's no other universe. There's nothing like that. It's just this universe, and it's always made up of the same elements, and those elements always have the exact same relationship to each other. And Aristotle points at the way in which the universe is organized like a living being. The processes of a living being, each part replenishes the other ones. The heart gives to the stomach what is necessary for the stomach to live, and the stomach gives to the heart what is necessary for the heart to live. They're reciprocally determined by each other. And he says we see the same thing in meteorology, in the study of the heavens, in the study of the atmosphere. And Aristotle does a very detailed study of meteorology in a couple of books. And he says that the elements actually interchange with one another. Water evaporates and becomes air, and air goes into fire, and earth becomes fire, and water can become earth, and all of the elements can change into each other. And they do so in cycles, and there's perpetual interchanging of all of the elements in cycles throughout the universe. And then he goes so far as to say that climate will shift continuously. So he says that in some places there was forests in ancient times, ancient for him, like thousands of years before his time in Greece. And those later became deserts. But he says in enough time they will become habitable again, because there's this continuous recirculation of energy. So the cosmos is like a living being. Keeps itself in a sense of homeostasis, and that's something that is essential in our understanding of the balancing of forces. And we talk about this in terms of water cycles now too. The energy is distributed throughout the system in continuous fluctuations. Some areas become dry, but then other areas become more moist, and then the moisture is retransplanted back to the dry areas, and in this continual process, this kind of like the water cycle itself. Now, Aristotle had a very rough understanding of this, nothing like the very in-depth understanding we have of it now, but he did have an understanding of it. So then the question becomes, does everything just repeat itself over and over again? How can there be novelty? If it's the same elements going around and just, rearranging themselves over and over again, can anything new really happen? Can there be an evolution of forms? Well, this question is very difficult, and there's kind of two sides to it. There's a kind of fundamental tension in Aristotle's worldview. On the one hand, he thinks that human nature, the form of a human, is something unchanging. It's not something that evolved. And he actually rejects Empedocles, who did have a theory of evolution. He said that there were older forms of life in which humans were more like apes. So he actually had a theory of evolution, and Aristotle rejects it. So he thinks that there are the same forms. A horse is always a horse, and you can go back an infinite amount of time, and there will be horses. At the same time, though, he says that time is ecstatic, displacing. It is a persistent advance into novelty. So he thinks that there are forms of government existing millions of years before his time that came to form the principles of philosophy, that came to understand science, that came to understand the gods and all of these things, and that they were destroyed, that they lost this knowledge. But he thinks that they will come again, that they will reemerge, and that science comes back. But every time it's going to be different. It's going to be different people, a different way of interpreting it. There might even be different languages, different ways of expressing science and all of this. But it will fundamentally always be coming back. And so there's a kind of repetition, but there's also a kind of novelty. And this is what's fundamentally, this fundamental tension in Aristotle's worldview. Between discovery and invention. There's never really invention, like we invented cars, but Aristotle would say that 1 billion years ago, someone else invented a car. Now, this cosmology doesn't hold up anymore. No one in science believes this anymore, that the universe can go on like this infinitely, and that all of the parts keep moving throughout forever. So this question of development versus evolution is, Aristotle's system brings it out, but he tries to escape this problem. So development means, we can think of music here. Development of a theme means two things. Either it means to establish the form as something immutable, which is what we would call vertical genesis. There's the rise of a perfect form of human society, and it always comes in the same way. There's a kind of vertical genesis. We come to the apex, and then it's maybe destroyed, but it will always re-emerge in a kind of vertical genesis. It's always coming up in the same way. Horizontal genesis, on the other hand, is an evolution. So in musical theory, horizontal development means not that we just come to the theme and then we know what it is and it's that theme, but like in dun 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 dun, that theme is developed over and over again into completely new sounds that sound completely different. And can we decide which one is the absolute form? No. And so horizontal genesis, evolution, that's the worldview that we have now, and it breaks outside of Aristotle's worldview, which is dominated by vertical genesis. So instead of having just coming to one idea or one form, and maybe it goes away, but it comes back every single time in the same way, no, we have a progressive general development, an evolution to ever new forms of life. And that's what we really don't find in Aristotle's cosmology.